Good morning, everybody. Just take a sec to get the slides up here. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll do a quick introduction why they come up. My name is Steve Escaravage. I lead Booz Allen's artificial intelligence practice. That's a team of about 600 people that supports professional services delivery across the federal government and private industry. And I would like to spend just a few minutes today sharing some of the lessons learned that we've observed delivering across this portfolio. I originally thought about calling this presentation, "If you do nothing else, do these things." So hopefully in just a few minutes, there'll be some takeaways that everybody can use. Coming down. I'm going to start just because of the interest of time. There's one slide that I'll skip through when I get a clicker that talks about our role. Just to give you some context, the overwhelming majority of the programs we support, we serve as a systems or solution integrator, where we are contracted to conduct tech scouting, select solutions, integrate those solutions, and in many cases, operate those solutions. And why is this relevant? We have seen, thank you, which one goes forward? This one? Yes. Okay. We've seen an incredible number of just a variety of applications of AI, software architectures, hardware configuration. So we have breadth. So the observations I'm going to share for you is from a really wide range of examples across many industries. And candidly, this is the role that we provide, is to obsess about delivering the outcome of the project. Okay. This is the question that we get asked most frequently. If you were to do nothing else on AI-related projects or programs, what should you do? And it's a loaded question because there's still incredible hype. There's really poorly managed expectations in some cases, and there's just this unbelievable elevated expectations in other organizations. We spent the past 2 years looking back across 200 projects, public sector mostly, but also in the private sector, to figure out what is working and what is not. Let's walk through those. First, the projects that are most successful are the ones who are obsessing about delivering an outcome and not injecting a capability into an organization. Specifically, obsessing about an outcome typically related to the objectives or key result of the organization. It's got to be something that the stakeholders care deeply about. It's something the leadership team is discussing. It's the value proposition of the organization. When we look back, many of the efforts related to injecting AI were focused on building or implementing a toolkit, standing up a data platform, standing up some type of ecosystem or enclave for experimentation. When we look back, those efforts struggled almost in all cases because they struggled to build momentum, they struggled to have sponsorship, they struggled to maintain funding as they're going through the areas. So focus on understanding the outcome, report progress in those areas. Second, the early days of AI, there was a lot of excitement. We're in a more mature area than that now. It is incredibly important to have, I used unmistakable, but a clear, transparent, easily understood measurement of the performance of the AI system, solution, or program that's in place in terms of that outcome we just talked about. Also, what is the baseline performance today? We underestimate how good most processes are that are in production or at scale today, and we sometimes do not have a target of where we're trying to get to in terms of performance. So establish a measurement approach, determine what the baseline is today, and report progress in terms of progress against that goal. Same thing with our return on investment. We still see many programs across large enterprises and small enterprises who don't have a formula for how they're going to deliver ROI, specifically back to the key objectives and metrics. That leads to failure in almost every case. Okay. Engineer to the current environment. How many people here are related to or working with a product-related company, a tech stack company, SaaS product? Raise your hands, please. Okay. what we see frequently is organizations are pitching a solution, they're building momentum around an idea, around something that's been demonstrated in a laboratory environment that they want to bring into real world operations, into production. The challenge is there's dependencies in the technical stack where they want to lift and shift a vertically integrated solution into a production environment. Whether it's in a federal agency or a Fortune 500 company, in many cases, that has a long lead time. And it's not measured in weeks. It's measured in months, and sometimes it could be 12 to 18 months. So what happens to a lot of programs is that we build the value proposition, the investment, the business case based on demonstrating some value in the organization, but using dependencies and tools that will not be available within a reasonable window. And this is where trust erodes. Everybody's excited about the kickoff of a project. 12 months later, everybody wants to wonder why we still don't have that value proposition, why we're not achieving initial results. We're waiting for dependencies to build up into the environment. So the most successful projects are the ones who are finding a pathway into production, and then they're building an evidence base and demonstrating why additional investment should be placed into that infrastructure. Same thing, similar topic, adoption and reuse. See many organizations who are standing up AI centers of excellence or enclaves, and they're kicking off a number of prototype, pilot, or pathfinder programs within the organization. When we check in on them 3 to 6 months later, they're all working on the same thing. They typically have very little to do with artificial intelligence. They're working on getting access to data. They're standing up computing enclaves. They're figuring out how to access any advanced computing that they have in the organization. They're building user interfaces, or worse, they're all completing security documentation, trying to get into production environments. Hopefully you all experience this. The problem is that when you do not build a strategy around reuse and you don't obsess about removing redundancy across your portfolio, you're putting pressure and stress on those organizational functions, like whoever controls the data management or data governance function. You have 12 projects leaning on a security official trying to get approval for accreditation and authority to operate because you haven't removed the redundancy in the organization. So I really like this graphic because the mindset should be you have to have a sense of the inventory of investments that you're making, and you have to be obsessive about removing redundancy. Yes, there's probably a more perfect interface. Yes, there's probably a more efficient data pipeline that you could create. But where you can reuse and focus on engineering to the end user's value, you'll see more return. Okay. The first two aspects of this, hopefully, will make sense. Adopt standards. Same thing that we've just been talking about with reuse. When you have things like a reference architecture, when you standardize around investments and you remove redundancy, you typically can focus your time and investment on the things that matter most to the organization. Progressively is the one that I get a bit of questions about. Why progressively? We see a lot of organizations right now who are struggling with the decision of what should I do around AI? Where do I start? How do I get value out of this? And so the default position is, let's create a bunch of governance around it. Let's make some decisions. Let's standardize around tooling. Let's put processes in place. Let's stand up some committees that can talk about it. You really need to balance the standardization early with the speed of innovation that you want to achieve and the degree of flexibility that you want to provide these programs. Most of the production solutions that we see look very different than the first or second generations of that same product, that same technical stack, because they're making trade-offs along the way. So you need to be a little bit careful. There are some areas, though, there are some table stakes we've all learned that it's time for us just to agree. There's been so much documentation and press on the ethical considerations and bias mitigation. There are some fantastic open source tool sets. Many of the companies are here this week who provide those. There are tool sets, there are frameworks. These are available. standardizing around an approach to doing that today, to me, feels like table stakes. The most successful projects are removing the noise in the system from rallying around an approach and defining what are the risks and how they're going to solve that component of the problem. And then secondly, it's the programs who are able to look into the future and say, it's probably a good time now while we can put our arms around it to define some standards around data pipelines, metadata standards, data pipelines, model standards. What's a model specification that we're going to use? The organizations who are spending a lot of time and money on building a machine-readable end-to-end governance framework and standards, we find are actually running into some trouble right now because they've over-specified for where they are in the maturity of the organization. Okay. If there's one thing that we believe is resulting in pilot purgatory, where projects and investments are getting stuck in the valley of death, they're getting stuck along their maturity, it's because we are setting unreasonably high expectations for what needs to be demonstrated to begin adopting a solution. And what I mean by this is that in our laboratory environments, it is difficult to create a representative view of what we deal with every day in production and real world environments. And I know we've all invested a lot of money, or you've all invested a lot of money in mirror environments, and your dev and tests and pre-prod are supposed to mirror production. They rarely do. And when you get into production, you run into a whole new series of events. What we try to advocate, and what we've seen from dozens and dozens of projects that have been successful, is they've adopted a two-step approach to operational integration. Step one is engineer your solution so that it conforms to the current production environment, get it into production, and have it implement a learning process where it's improving over time. This is step one. It's not intended to demonstrate great value to the organization. It's not intended to try to achieve those measures we talked about earlier. It's getting into the real world environment to learn and to demonstrate that A, it's doing no harm, B, we have a pathway to sustainability, which we'll talk about next, and C, we can start to understand what are some of the dependencies and can we run this at scale. The second milestone then, the second summit, is are we observing the type of impact that the business case, the investment case was dependent on, so that we can then move to cut over and actually use these capabilities. If you're bringing a product to market, if you're running an AI portfolio, if there's one thing to do, it is implementing these two-step processes. This is what all the successful programs are pivoting to today. I mentioned sustainment. The projects that are beginning to scale, so they've not just achieved a state of adoption and a state of use, but they're beginning to scale, are typically the projects who have optimized the retraining and update process where they're getting better models, better capabilities into production quickly. In the world where I come from, in the federal government and in highly regulated industries in the commercial sector, you typically do not have access to the production environments. It's not friends and family access mode. You have to have a mature approach to DevSecOps. You have to have a mature approach to MLOps and model ops. You have to understand how you're going to maintain it. Who's going to do it? I always like the example of when you get something delivered to you, the mail delivery who kicks the package to the door. You see that a lot in AI-related projects, is there is no game plan for after first deployment. And so I would encourage you all to think about sustainment early. And related, quick show of hands. Whose primary function at their organization is AI training and or hypercare for AI solutions? Show of hands, anybody here in the room? There never is. And that's everything you need to know about this. The programs that are most successful are realizing typically too late that this is a huge component. These systems are not always intuitive. We're asking folks to use capability, and they're sensitive. It's AI. There's all this hype about it. This is something that the larger programs today are realizing was something that should have been thought about more strategically early on in the process. Software developers, mathematicians, this is not their primary skill set. There are people with real expertise in this area, and so I would encourage you to engage them. Just one last concept. Really, this is not just manage the risk, it's manage expectations. We've talked about it a lot, about chasing an outcome, about defining a performance metric, about reuse, about trying to get quickly. The projects that we look back at, like I said, about 200 of them, they all face delays, getting access to data, getting access to infrastructure, reconfiguring the infrastructure to meet the problem or application, getting security accreditation. You know what the typical delays are that we saw? See about 4-month delays at the union of data and infrastructure access, and then an additional 2 to 5 months delay for security accreditation and approval. That's 6 to 9 months. Every time we reach out, we're doing tech scouting, we're looking for a new capability to inject, we always get 90-day MVP proposals. And we just laugh at them, candidly, because 90 days, that doesn't fit within the window that we typically run into. It's about managing expectations. There's an opportunity to leverage as a community all of these insights and keep that trough of disillusionment maybe not as deep as it's going to be otherwise. And lastly, attrition. When we look back across all of the portfolio, our book of business, all the key attributes, the one factor that was most highly associated with program success, AI project success, and initial adoption, I should be clear, initial adoption, was retention of key engineering talent and the stakeholder who kicked off an AI program. That was it. We were surprised. Figured it would be method, technique, the maturity of the area. Nope. You lose one person from a key program, bad news. You lose 2, especially if one is the engineering lead or the product lead, one's the stakeholder. It's time to really think about closing up shop on that project and re-vectoring it to new area. That's it. So again, be outcome focused instead of capability focused where you can. Make sure you understand what good versus great looks like in terms of performance. Engineer to the current environment versus some idealized state. Those cutovers to those idealized states are not coming. Reuse, focus on sustainability, create a 2-step approach to outcomes. Bring somebody in who knows how to do training in hypercare, and then avoid the common pitfalls that every project's running into. Thanks for your time.